as it always starts, Kale and I are chatting, and then we start getting on topic, and it's like, dang it, we better start recording because we're chatting about personal stuff, and personal stuff sort of leads to
the good stuff,
which sort of brings us around to the ostensible topic of this, even though, of course, in Harry Potter, I only know the movies, but yeah, it was pretty obvious to see that the visiting professor of defense against the dark arts, that wasn't exactly the character in the movie you wanted to be.
Right. Yeah, it meant that you had a one-film contract, really. I mean, let's be honest.
Your previous instruction in this subject has been disturbingly uneven.
In Harry Potter, the defensive against the dark arts is sort of in this sleepwalking phase.
There's nothing in here about using defensive spells?
Using spells? Well, I can't imagine why you would need to use spells in my classroom.
Why would you even need a defense against the dark arts thing? Because Voldemort is gone, right? Or so you think.
It is the view of the ministry that a theoretical knowledge will be sufficient to get you through your examinations, which, after all, is what school is all about.
And how's theory supposed to prepare us for what's out there?
There is nothing out there, dear.
The question is always, how do you teach this thing? And so there's this desire to suppress it. As a school teacher, I think a lot about these issues anyway. I see what you can do with a student in high school, but I know that they're being kind of frog marched into a kind of world that, in certain respects, I feel that I have ill prepared them for, because they're going to go to college, and either they sort of do one of two things, Paul. They either become pragmatist nihilists, or they become true believers in the new gospel.
And the new gospel is?
Donald J. Trump is now president of the United States.
The new gospel can either be a kind of politically tinged gospel of liberation, we might call it.
I think their concerns are legitimate. They're articulating ideas that have to do with race, ethnicity, power, privilege, and we're taking a look at them.
Or a kind of a nihilism.
Which I will have my revenge against humanity.
What they all seem to rest upon is what Taylor talks about as the immanent frame.
We have the sense of living in a large, impersonal, immanent order. And it doesn't make any intrinsic reference to anything beyond, to God or spirits and so on. And that's something absolutely unprecedented in human history.
It presupposes that metaphysics are a waste of time, at the very least, probably a psyop against you by the powers that be. And so this little corner business, right, it's sort of a reopening up of that frame, or a reconnecting, maybe, that frame to that which has been forsaken.
Okay, let me back up a little bit.
Yeah.
Irish Catholics, Italian Catholics, Dutch Calvinists, probably Norwegian Lutherans, all of these groups came into the United States, late 19th, early 20th century. Of course, the two world wars, and between the wars disrupted some of that. That impacted the African-American population, which of course is a big part of my story, the Great Migration up to the north. Many of these groups were set against each other. What happens in this great movement in the United States is that they all become, brothers and sisters in arms. You're looking across the bunk in your transport across the Pacific, and he's got his rosary, and you're looking at him saying, well, that's idolatrous, that rosary. You're looking at all of this stuff, but in the end, you're in the foxhole with this guy, and you eventually say, I'm not so sure he's not going to heaven with me. Maybe we need to look at the old ways and reconsider them. We had a confidence in our churches that we no longer have. And part of what was lost in the transport ships going across the Pacific was that confidence. Because a lot of that confidence was built on, I'm right and you Catholics are wrong. Then with the counterculture, the civil rights movement had a big piece of this. It was impossible for mainliners eventually evangelicals, Roman Catholics, to not look at the systemic, multi-generational treatment of African Americans and say, wow, did we ever miss that? And if we missed that, what else did we miss? And I think there's a big part of the rise of the urban monoculture.
So if I talk with a progressive Muslim or a progressive Jew or a progressive Catholic, and I scratch beneath the surface, often their morals, their views on gender, their views on what future they want for the world are all very, very similar. So when I talk about the monoculture, that's what I'm talking about. This thing that wants to, when my kids go to school, say, this is what correct morality is, this is the way you should see the world, and if your parents are telling you anything else, they're deplorable and wrong.
In the culture of the 60s and 70s, the catechism was thought to be, first of all, pedagogically, it was archaic because it was rote memorization. Teacher asks the questions, students memorize and gives the answer, and you're graded on how you can memorize the answer. My bet is what I'm saying now, there are perfect analogs in Catholicism.
The corollary in the Catholic world would be the Tridentine Catechism. There was an abandonment of the notion of repetitions as a formative reality. It's almost like we wanted to have the feeling without the content.
There was a reason behind the dismissal of rote memorization as a formative tool. And there was a hermeneutic of suspicion operating there.
So this is an idea from Ricoeur, and the hermeneutics of suspicion is basically, underneath it, there's always a secret agenda, a hidden motive.
This is what you're doing, or this is what you're really doing.
Yeah. That appearances are distracting, they're distorting, there's misleading. You can only realize something's an illusion in comparison to something else that you take to be real. The hermeneutics of beauty actually is primary, and the hermeneutics of suspicion is completely parasitic on it.
So we threw out the programmatic repetition and formation by memorization of our youth and gave it all to Set.
I'm Grim Grizz from the internet. So Set fits into the story of Osiris, Set, Horus, and Isis. And it's theoretically an encapsulation of what the Egyptians learned about government. And at some point, Set overthrows Osiris because the Osiris has become old and willfully blind. On some level, it maps to people getting their communal programming from at least everybody goes to church, to at least everybody's watching the same 3 networks. Right. So Set in our time became the television set, and pretty much every house has an altar to Set. And the fact that these forces are powers and principalities, and it's not just ATV or just a broadcasting company, it's the manifestation of something big.
Everything that exists is both an agent and a body. Something that is acting on the world, and something which is being acted upon and is a body for other things. When you notice patterns and behaviors in the world that actually coalesce, you don't necessarily always need a human chain of causality for it to happen. You just need to understand how transpersonal agency works. And it can help us to not go into crazy paranoid fantasies when we notice patterns, because then we start to imagine all these like weird secret conspiracies. Like you actually don't need them for it to be real. It's worse because sometimes it's just demons.
It seems to manifest a kind of enthralling spirit. Is that sort of what we mean here?
I don't know, it's almost like an in-betwixt dream state, that everything on it has been designed to capture attention as you walk by. It's like a communal dream spell.
I've discovered, to my amazement, that if you take some violent and irritating process, say like radio or TV, and start looking at how it works, what it's doing to you and why it's doing it to you, you can get very enthralled, very excited. We are re-entering the old tribal world, but this time we're going to go through the tribal dance and the tribal dream wide awake.
There's all of these implicit liturgies
Yes.
that have in fact been forming the urban monoculture.
The Christian Reformed Church discussing a report on human sexuality, and it has drawn concerns from some members.
Suddenly you get to Synod 2022 and 2023.
And Synod drew a hard line and said, line here, and we are going to use the strongest possible language that we can because of how serious of the crisis that we're in.
And the progressives who have, just by virtue of their filters, imagine they are the vanguard of history and everyone will sweep along and it's only a matter of time. Just go back and listen to those synods. They're all on YouTube. Speech after speech after speech of the progressives are basically reciting their liturgies.
How are we so certain that our interpretation of the truth now is what really God intended?
I don't think LGBTQ plus people are any more broken than you and I stand against the motion.
On behalf of the pain that was caused to many in the LGBTQ community, I will be leaving Synod in protest.
And then the votes are taken and it's like, we're 30% of the church.
Yeah,
we're 30% of the votes. Your votes are no longer there because your churches are no longer there.
You were all worried about being in front of the arc of history. You forgot the future.
What people see at any time, what their attention is focused upon, is always the rearview mirror, never the present image or the present fact. The future of the future is the present, and this is something that people are terrified of.
Now here we are today, Protestant and Catholic, looking at what has happened. We want to rescue the gospel from something because it seems to have gone astray. We're tending to set the gospel into this document. And therefore, if we can reliably transpose this document from this page into the memory of people, we can deliver something into this world in all of its Vervakian 4 P's of knowing sort of way. The gospel is best instantiated in a human being. Now, of course, as Christians, we say the archetypal gospel instantiation is, of course, Christ.
And so what you have in the figure of Christ is an actual person who actually lived, plus a myth. And in some sense, Christ is the union of those two things. The problem is I probably believe that.
A classic sort of Catholic talking point is, well, how did all those people get saved before the books?
Yeah.
There was a time, a pretty big chunk of time, in which there was nothing written down, certainly nothing collected. So then, well, how did it happen? And I remember much later on reading a novel called Quo Vadis. The Roman officer falls in love with Lygia, and he doesn't understand why she won't sleep with him. So you have this encounter of the pagan sexual ethic and this Christian sexual ethic. And as he falls in love with her, and he's sort of being catechized in a way by her example, she takes him to the catacombs and he meets Peter.
Oh?
To die as our Lord died is more than I deserve.
So then, of course, my mind is popping at this point, being like, oh my gosh, that's right. Like on some radically one-to-one level, everybody who now calls themselves Christian owes that gift, that fact, to somebody somewhere 2,000 years ago shook hands with Peter, with Paul, like the person. Can you imagine that, Paul? What must that have been like? I mean, talk about charismatic. I mean, that must have been, well, miraculous. Right, miraculous. If you had been 20 years older than Luther, let's say, you would have had a memory of a world without books and without Columbus. What you think of as possible and real is radically different. It's an axial revolution. So Luther was 11 when Columbus discovered the New World.
Yeah.
This is a very specific generation in which they know about the New World, and the Gutenberg press has always been a reality. That's just crazy.
All of these years of education, no one ever pointed that out.
Yeah.
As if it was incidental.
Like, oh yeah, by the way, Columbus, Gutenberg, whatever, let's get back to Luther. Like, no, like, they are formed by their social imaginary, just like we are.
It catapults Spain into this Catholic superpower, which then, of course, is going to set the Protestants as tremendously terrified of Roman Catholics for now generations to come into the Americas. And people wonder, why so much anti-Catholicism in America? They're scared to death of the French and the Spanish.
Your folk up in the Netherlands, they were run by the Spaniards.
Yeah, they revolted. And even back to the Heidelberg Catechism, if you're in northern Germany and you want to resist on the economics, the politics, all of these things, you of course adopt a different religion.
Before the Dodgers took on the San Francisco Giants, they paid special tribute to a group called the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. The members in drag are heavily made up with different names and personas, but all don variations of their traditional nun's habit. That fact distresses or outrages countless Catholics and Christians, driving many of them to demonstrate and rally before Friday night's game, the culmination of weeks of fiery debate and flip-flopping.
We asked before, okay, how does the gospel get transmitted if you don't have a catechism? Well, and the same with the urban monoculture. How does the urban monoculture get transmitted if you keep your catechism implicit? In a sense, it's a little easier because, especially depending on what exactly your gospel is, you can keep tinkering with it as you go. And because of basically the perpetual amnesia of successive generations and human beings, you can very quickly forget that, oh yeah.
That's really perilous territory. What I found out as a young adult who started to do a deep read into my own tradition is that why didn't anybody ever tell me about any of this stuff? Like, why wasn't I given my inheritance? So therefore, if it's true in this way, it was also true in terms of, like an English class or, a film class or a culture class, that all this stuff had been withheld from me. Now, at the time, I didn't know if that was like, did somebody just forget, or was there some kind of purpose behind this? And, I guess at this point, I think it was probably on purpose in a very real way.
Expelliarmus!
What I'm worried about with my own students is how can I get them to affect both a detached and deeply engaged standpoint to see the world.
An excellent idea to show them that.
Perhaps it would be prudent to first teach the students to block unfriendly spells, Professor.
I think we go all the way back to where we started about the catechism, which is, Kale, you can only give them what you have. And what you have is you. You are the defense against the dark arts professor.
And I've lasted more than 1 year, so that's good, I guess.
If I am proud of anything, it is of how much you have learned this year.
I'm coming to the realization that there's really little difference between what we're trying to do and what, in my own tradition, we would have just called, you have to be a saint.
The kingdom of heaven isn't behind a paywall. The kingdom of heaven isn't at the front of an enormous line that you don't have time or life or money or leisure to wait in. The kingdom of heaven is at hand, and is at hand for any of us. You have people around you right now who need to be loved, and you can love them. And that's where it starts.